The advertisement in the Carson City newspaper had been simple enough. Caregiver needed for elderly woman, room and board provided, modest wages, must be of good character and strong constitution. And Grace Zimmerman had torn it from the page with trembling fingers that November morning in 1883. She stood now on the dusty main street of Grass Valley, California, clutching a worn carpetbag and squinting against the afternoon sun that hung low over the Sierra Nevada foothills. The stagecoach that had brought her rattled away in a cloud of red dust, leaving her alone among the rough wooden buildings and the curious stares of miners and merchants going about their business. Grace smoothed down her traveling dress, a faded blue cotton that had seen better days, and tried to still the nervous flutter in her stomach. A tall figure approached from across the street, weaving between a hay wagon and two men on horseback. He moved with an easy confidence that spoke of someone comfortable in his own skin, his boots kicking up small puffs of dust with each step. As he drew closer, Grace found herself staring despite her better judgment. He was perhaps 28 or 29, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar of his worn shirt, and eyes the color of strong coffee beneath the brim of his hat. His jaw was shadowed with stubble, and there was a wariness in his expression that softened slightly when he stopped a respectful distance away. "Miss Zimmerman." His voice was deep and rough, like gravel rolling in a creek bed. "Yes, I am she. You must be Mr. Harlan Zane." Grace kept her voice steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. He nodded once, reaching up to touch the brim of his hat in greeting. "I appreciate you coming all this way. The ranch is about 5 miles outside town. I have a wagon ready when you are." Grace noticed the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the tightness in his shoulders. This was a man carrying heavy burdens. "I am ready now, Mr. Zane. I have only what I carry." Something flickered in his expression. Might have been sympathy or understanding, but he simply gestured toward a wagon hitched outside the general store. As they walked, Grace became aware of the sounds of Grass Valley around them. The distant hammering from the stamp mills processing ore from the Empire and North Star mines, the lowing of cattle being driven down a side street, the tinny sound of a piano from one of the saloons. The town had the raw, unfinished quality of all mining settlements, buildings thrown up quickly to serve the needs of men seeking fortune in the California gold country. Harlan helped her into the wagon with surprising gentleness, his hand warm and calloused against hers for just a moment before he released it and climbed up beside her. The wagon creaked as he took up the reins, and they rolled out of town heading east toward the hills. For a long while, neither spoke. Grace watched the landscape change from the bare slopes surrounding the town to rolling hills dotted with oak trees and tall grass turned golden by the dry season. The afternoon sun painted everything in shades of amber and copper. Finally, unable to bear the silence any longer, she ventured, "Your mother, what is her condition?" Harlan's jaw tightened. "She had a stroke 6 months ago, left her weak on one side. She can speak, but it tires her. Mostly she needs help with daily things, dressing, bathing, cooking." He paused, and Grace heard the strain in his voice when he continued. "I have been managing, but the ranch demands most of my time, and she deserves better care than I can provide alone. You have no siblings, no other family, no siblings. My father died when I was 19. Been just the two of us running the ranch for the past 10 years. He glanced at her briefly, and Grace saw something raw in his expression. "She raised me alone after he passed. Never complained, never gave up, even when times were lean. I owe her everything." The love in his voice was unmistakable, and Grace felt something in her chest constrict with an emotion she could not quite name. "I will do my best by her, Mr. Zane. You have my word." He nodded, and they fell silent again. But it was a different kind of silence now, less awkward and more companionable. The Zane ranch appeared as they crested a low hill, a collection of weathered buildings nestled in a valley where a creek ran silver through the grass. The main house was modest but well-maintained, built of logs with a stone chimney from which smoke rose in a lazy spiral. A barn stood nearby, and Grace could see cattle grazing in the distance, dark shapes against the golden hills. There was something peaceful about the place, a sense of rootedness that Grace had not felt in the 3 years since her father had died and left her alone in the world. Harlan brought the wagon to a stop in front of the house and jumped down, then came around to help Grace descend. She took his offered hand and stepped carefully to the ground, smoothing her skirts and looking up at the house that would be her home for the foreseeable future. "Come on inside," Harlan said, already moving toward the door. "I will introduce you to my mother." The interior of the house was dim after the bright sunlight, and it took Grace's eyes a moment to adjust. The main room served as both kitchen and sitting area, with a sturdy table and chairs on one side and a stone fireplace on the other. Everything was neat but spare, the home of people who valued function over decoration. A hallway led to what Grace assumed were bedrooms, and from one of these came a querulous voice. "Harlan, is that you? Did you bring her?" "Yes, Mother, we are coming." Harlan gestured for Grace to follow him down the hallway. The bedroom was small but bright, with a window overlooking the valley and a simple iron bed against one wall. In the bed, propped up on pillows, was a woman who must have been in her early 50s, though illness had aged her. Her hair was more gray than brown, pulled back in a loose braid, and her face was pale. But her eyes were sharp and bright as they fixed on Grace, assessing her with an intensity that made Grace stand a little straighter. "Mother, this is Miss Grace Zimmerman. Miss Zimmerman, my mother, Harlan Zane." "How do you do, Mrs. Zane?" Grace moved closer to the bed, meeting the older woman's gaze steadily. "I am pleased to meet you." Harlan Zane studied her for a long moment, and Grace held her breath, knowing that everything depended on this woman's acceptance. Finally, Helen's stern expression softened slightly. "You are younger than I expected. How old are you, girl?" "I am 24, madam. I know I look younger, but I assure you I am capable. I cared for my father through his final illness, and I have experience with household management and nursing care." 24, Helen repeated, her eyes sliding to her son. "Hardly more than a child yourself." "Mother," Harlan said, a warning note in his voice. "Hush, I am only speaking my mind." Helen turned her attention back to Grace. "Can you cook? Really cook, I mean, not just boil beans and burn biscuits." Grace felt a smile tug at her lips. "I can cook, madam. My father was particular about his meals. I can make bread, stews, roasts, pies if you have the ingredients." Helen's expression brightened. "Pies? I have not had a decent pie since this damned affliction struck me down." She waved her left hand, the right one lying still on the coverlet. "Well, you will do, I suppose. Better than having my son fussing over me like a mother hen. You can start by making supper. Harlan will show you the kitchen." Grace recognized a dismissal when she heard one. She nodded respectfully and followed Harlan back to the main room, where he showed her the pantry and the supplies on hand. There was flour and lard, dried beans and salt pork, some withered potatoes and carrots, and precious little else. "I know it is not much," Harlan said, and Grace heard embarrassment in his voice. "I have not been to town for proper supplies in a while. I can go tomorrow if you make a list of what you need." Grace surveyed the meager stores and made a decision. "I can work with this for tonight. Tomorrow I will take inventory and make a proper list. But Mr. Zane, if I am to cook and care for your mother, I will need a budget for supplies." "Of course. Whatever you need." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch, counting out coins onto the table. "Will this suffice for now?" Grace looked at the money and nodded. It was more than generous. "This will do nicely, thank you. Your room is the small one at the end of the hall. It is not much, but it is clean and private." Harlan shifted his weight, suddenly awkward. "I should get back to work. There are evening chores to be done. If you need anything, just holler." He was gone before Grace could respond, the door closing behind him with a soft thud. She stood alone in the kitchen, looking around at the space that would be her domain, and felt the weight of responsibility settle onto her shoulders. These people were depending on her now. She could not, would not, let them down. She set to work with practiced efficiency, first checking on Helen and making sure she was comfortable, then returning to the kitchen to prepare supper. She found that someone, probably Harlan, had laid a fire in the stove earlier, so she stoked it up and put water on to boil. The salt pork she sliced thin and fried until it was crispy, the fat rendering out to flavor the potatoes and carrots she cut up and added to the pan. It was simple fare, but the smells that filled the kitchen were homey and comforting. As she worked, Grace found herself thinking about Harlan Zane. There was something about him that drew her, though she could not quite put her finger on what it was. Perhaps it was the gentle way he had spoken of his mother, or the weariness in his eyes that spoke of burdens carried alone for too long. Or perhaps it was simply that he had not looked at her the way most men did, with calculation or dismissal, but rather with a kind of quiet respect that had been absent from her life for far too long. She shook her head, chiding herself for foolishness. She was here to work, not to moon over her employer. The last thing she needed was to develop feelings for a man who saw her only as a hired caregiver. The sound of the door opening made her turn. Harlan stood in the doorway, hat in hand, his hair damp with sweat from his labors. "Smells good," he said simply. "It will be ready soon. Would you like to eat with your mother, or shall I bring her a tray? She usually prefers to eat in bed, says it is less fuss." Harlan moved to the water pump and worked the handle, splashing water on his face and hands. "I will eat at the table if that suits you." "Of course." Grace prepared a tray for Helen, loading it with food and a cup of water, then carried it carefully down the hall. She found Helen awake and alert, propped up on her pillows and looking out the window at the fading light. "I brought your supper, madam." Helen turned her head, and Grace saw tears glinting in her eyes. "Thank you, child. It has been a long time since someone other than my son cared for me." Grace set the tray on Helen's lap, arranging it so the older woman could reach everything with her good hand. "You have a fine son, if you do not mind me saying so. Not every man would go to such trouble for his mother." "No, not every man." Helen picked up the fork awkwardly, and Grace resisted the urge to help, sensing that the woman's pride required her to feed herself when she could. "Harlan is a good boy, man, I should say. Sometimes I still see him as the child he was, trailing after his father, trying to be big and strong." Her voice softened. "He has had to be both for so long now." Grace understood. "I will do my best to ease his burden, Mrs. Zane. That is why I am here." Helen looked at her sharply. "Is it? Or are you running from something like so many who come west?" The question caught Grace off guard, and for a moment she could not find words. Finally, she said quietly, "Perhaps a bit of both, but that does not make me any less committed to this work." Helen studied her for another long moment, then nodded. "Fair enough. We all have our ghosts. Now leave me to eat in peace. This food is getting cold." Grace returned to the kitchen to find Harlan seated at the table, waiting. She dished out food for both of them and sat down across from him, feeling suddenly nervous. She was not accustomed to dining with her employers. In her previous position, she had eaten in the kitchen after the family was served. "You do not need to wait on me," Harlan said, as if reading her thoughts. "We are not fancy people here. I eat when the food is ready and where it is convenient." Grace relaxed slightly and picked up her fork. They ate in silence for a few minutes, and she was gratified to see Harlan cleaning his plate with evident appreciation. "This is good," he said finally. "Better than anything I have managed in months. Thank you. It is only simple fare, but I will do better once I have proper supplies." Harlan nodded, pushing his empty plate away. "About the arrangements. I sleep in the barn most nights during the warm months, gives you and Mother more privacy in the house. In winter, I use the back bedroom, but I am up before dawn and usually do not return until after dark. You will have the run of the house most days." Grace found this both reassuring and oddly disappointing, though she could not have said why. "That seems very considerate, Mr. Zane. Just Harlan is fine. We are not formal folk." He stood, taking his plate to the wash basin. "I will leave you to settle in. If you need anything, ring the bell on the porch. I will hear it in the barn." "Thank you, Harlan." His name felt strange on her tongue, intimate somehow. He paused at the door, turning back. "I am glad you came, Miss Zimmerman. I think you will be good for my mother." Then he was gone again, leaving Grace alone with the dishes and her thoughts. The days fell into a rhythm with surprising ease. Grace rose at dawn to start the fire and prepare breakfast, then helped Helen with her morning ablutions. The older woman was prickly about accepting help, but Grace learned to offer assistance without making it seem like charity. After breakfast, there were the daily chores: washing, mending, cleaning, cooking. Helen liked to sit by the window in the afternoons, and Grace would often read to her from the few books in the house, or simply talk. Grace learned that Helen had come west as a young bride in 1854, following her husband Daniel in his search for gold. They had found modest success and bought the ranch, intending it as a place to settle and raise children. But children had been slow in coming, and Harlan had been their only child, born when Helen was nearly 30 and had given up hope of motherhood. "He was a miracle," Helen said one afternoon as they sat together, Grace darning socks while Helen watched. "I had prayed so long for a child. When he finally came, I promised God I would raise him right, teach him to be a good man. I think I kept that promise." "You did," Grace assured her. "Anyone can see that Harlan is a good man." Helen smiled, a rare expression that transformed her careworn face. "You like him, do not you?" Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I hardly know him, madam." "That is not what I asked." Helen's eyes were shrewd. "I see how you look at him when he comes in for meals, and I see how he looks at you when he thinks no one is watching. Mrs. Zane, I assure you, I have no designs on your son. I am here to work, nothing more." "Designs," Helen repeated with a snort. "I am not suggesting you are scheming, girl. I am merely observing. And what I observe is two young people who could use some happiness in their lives, dancing around each other like nervous colts." Grace did not know what to say to that, so she focused on her darning and said nothing at all. But Helen's words stayed with her, and she found herself increasingly aware of Harlan's presence. He was not a talkative man, but he was thoughtful in small ways. He brought wildflowers from the hills and left them in a jar on the kitchen table. He repaired the loose board on the porch steps before Grace could trip on it. He asked her opinion on matters around the ranch, seeming genuinely interested in her thoughts. And yes, sometimes she caught him looking at her with an expression she could not quite read, something warm and wondering that made her heart beat faster. It was late November, 3 weeks after Grace's arrival, when the first real test of her nursing skills came. She was in the kitchen kneading bread dough when she heard a crash from Helen's room, followed by a cry. Grace dropped everything and ran, her heart in her throat. Helen was on the floor beside the bed, her face twisted with pain and frustration. "I tried to get up on my own," she gasped. "My legs just gave out." "It is all right, do not move." Grace knelt beside her, quickly assessing for injuries. "Does anything hurt? Did you hit your head?" "Just my pride," Helen said bitterly. "I am so tired of being helpless." "You are not helpless. You just need to ask for help sometimes." Grace slipped her arms around the older woman, surprised by how light she was, how fragile. "On three, I am going to help you up. 1, 2, 3. With effort, Grace got Helen back into bed, then checked her over more thoroughly. There were no injuries beyond what would probably be a nasty bruise on one hip, but Helen was shaking with exhaustion and emotion. "I hate this," Helen whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I hate being weak. I hate being a burden." Grace sat on the edge of the bed and took Helen's hand. "You are not a burden. You are a person dealing with a difficult situation, and you are allowed to feel frustrated. But you are not alone. Harlan and I are here, and we want to help." "Why?" Helen's voice was raw. "Why do you care? You barely know us." Grace thought about the question, about her own loneliness in the years after her father's death, the sense of being adrift in the world with no anchor. "Because everyone deserves to be cared for," she said finally. "And because, whether you believe it or not, I have come to care about you. You remind me of my own mother, though she died when I was young, strong and stubborn and worth 10 of most people." Helen squeezed her hand, and they sat together in silence until the older woman's breathing evened out and she drifted into sleep. That evening, Grace told Harlan what had happened, watching worry crease his brow. "I should have been here," he said, guilt evident in his voice. "You were working. That is what you need to do. I was here, and that is what I am supposed to do." Grace gentled her voice. "Harlan, you cannot be everywhere at once. Your mother is safe. She is recovering. But these things take time." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Grace saw exhaustion and gratitude and something else in his eyes, something that made her breath catch. "I do not know what we did to deserve you, Grace Zimmerman, but I am grateful you are here." It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his rough voice sent warmth spreading through her chest. "I am grateful to be here," she said softly, and meant it. December brought cold winds sweeping down from the mountains, and with them, snow. Not the heavy snows of the high country, but enough to dust the hills white and make the mornings bitter. Harlan moved back into the house, taking the small bedroom at the back, and Grace grew accustomed to the sounds of him moving around in the early morning darkness, stoking fires and preparing for the day's work. One morning, Grace rose earlier than usual to find Harlan already in the kitchen, heating water for coffee. He looked surprised to see her. "I did not mean to wake you," he said. "You did not. I am just used to rising early." Grace moved to the stove, taking over the coffee preparation. "Go sit. I will have this ready in a moment." Harlan hesitated, then did as she said, settling into a chair at the table. Grace was aware of his eyes on her as she worked, and the silence between them felt charged with unspoken things. "Grace," he said finally, and she turned to face him. "I have been meaning to say something, and I am not good with words, so I will just say it plain. You have made a difference here. Not just in caring for my mother, though you have been wonderful with her, but in other ways too. The house feels like a home again. There is life here, warmth." I had forgotten what that was like. Grace's hand stilled on the coffee pot. "I am only doing my job, Harlan." "No," he said firmly. "You are doing more than that. You care, truly care, and that is not something that can be hired." He stood, moving closer, and Grace's heart began to race. "I want you to know that you are appreciated, that you are valued, not just as a caregiver but as a person." She could see the sincerity in his dark eyes, the openness that he usually kept hidden behind reserve. "Thank you," she whispered. "That means more to me than you know." They stood there, only a few feet apart, and Grace felt the pull between them like a physical thing. She wondered if he would close the distance, if he would touch her, and part of her desperately wanted him to. But the moment was broken by the sound of Helen calling from her room, and Grace stepped back, smoothing her skirts with trembling hands. "I should go see to your mother," she said. "Yes, of course." Harlan's voice was rough, and when Grace glanced back at him from the doorway, she saw him standing with his hands clenched at his sides, staring after her with an expression that made her whole body feel warm. The weeks leading up to Christmas were busy ones. Grace threw herself into preparations, determined to make the holiday special for Helen. She baked pies and cookies, using precious sugar and dried fruit. She convinced Harlan to cut a small pine tree from the hills, which she decorated with strings of popcorn and dried apple slices. She even managed to knit a warm shawl for Helen, working on it in the evenings after the older woman had gone to sleep. Helen watched these preparations with a mixture of pleasure and sadness. "I have not celebrated Christmas properly since Daniel died," she admitted one afternoon. "It seemed like too much effort when it was just Harlan and me, and we were both too tired to care." "Well, this year will be different," Grace said firmly. "This year we will celebrate." On Christmas Eve, Grace prepared a special supper. Roast chicken with gravy, potatoes mashed with butter and cream, carrots glazed with honey and fresh biscuits. For dessert, she had made an apple pie with a lattice crust, and the smell of cinnamon and sugar filled the house. Harlan came in from the barn looking wind-blown and cold, but his face lit up when he saw the feast laid out on the table. "Grace, this is incredible." "It is Christmas," she said simply. "It should be special." They ate together, all three of them, with Helen sitting at the table in the chair Harlan had carefully carried her to. The older woman's eyes shone with pleasure and something that might have been tears as she looked around at the decorated house and the abundance of food. "This is the best Christmas I have had in years," she said softly. "Thank you, Grace. Thank you for bringing joy back into this house." After supper, Grace brought out small gifts she had made or bought in town on one of her supply trips. A new pipe for Harlan, a soft bed jacket for Helen, some peppermint sticks to share. In return, Harlan presented her with a package wrapped in brown paper. "It is not much," he said, looking embarrassed, "but I noticed your old one was worn through." Grace unwrapped the package to find a beautiful pair of leather gloves, butter-soft and lined with wool. They must have cost him dearly, and she felt tears prick her eyes. "Harlan, these are too fine." "I cannot accept them." "You can and you will," he said gruffly. "You work hard and you deserve to have warm hands." Grace slipped the gloves on and they fit perfectly. "Thank you," she whispered. "I will treasure them." Their eyes met across the table, and Grace saw in his gaze all the things he was not saying. "I see you. I appreciate you. I care for you." Her heart swelled with an answering emotion, warm and terrifying and wonderful all at once. Helen, watching them both, smiled to herself and said nothing. January brought bitter cold, and with it, new challenges. Helen caught a cold that settled in her chest, and for a terrifying week, Grace nursed her through fever and coughing fits that left the older woman exhausted. Grace barely slept, dozing in a chair beside Helen's bed, waking at every sound to check on her patient. Harlan hovered anxiously, torn between his duties on the ranch and his fear for his mother. Grace saw the strain wearing on him, the dark circles under his eyes, the tightness around his mouth. "You need to rest," she told him one evening, finding him sitting beside his mother's bed while Grace took a brief break. "You will be no good to anyone if you collapse from exhaustion." "I cannot lose her," he said, his voice breaking. "She is all I have left." Grace sat down beside him, taking his hand in hers without thinking. You will not lose her. She is strong and she is fighting, but she needs you to be strong too. Go get some sleep. I will watch over her." Harlan looked down at their joined hands, then up at her face. "What about you? You have barely slept in days. I will rest when she is better, I promise." He squeezed her hand gently. "You are remarkable, Grace Zimmerman. I hope you know that." Before she could respond, he stood and left the room, leaving Grace with her racing heart and the sound of Helen's labored breathing. The fever broke 3 days later, and Helen woke weak but clear-eyed, demanding broth and complaining about being coddled. Grace could have wept with relief. Instead, she brought the requested broth and sat with Helen while she sipped it slowly. "You are a good nurse," Helen said. "Better than good. You have the gift of healing hands and a caring heart." "I only did what needed to be done," Grace demurred. "No, you did more than that. You gave us hope when things seemed darkest." Helen set down her spoon and looked at Grace seriously. "My son is in love with you. You know that, do not you?" Grace felt her face flame. "Mrs. Zane, I hardly think that is appropriate to discuss." "Why not? I am an old woman who nearly died. If that does not give me the right to speak plain, I do not know what does." Helen's eyes were sharp despite her weakness. "The question is, do you love him back?" Grace opened her mouth to deny it, to say something proper and deflecting, but found she could not. "Yes," she whispered. "I think I do. But that does not mean anything can come of it. I am your employee, nothing more." "Nonsense. You are a woman and he is a man, and love does not care about employment arrangements." Helen reached out and took Grace's hand. "I see how happy you make him, how he has come alive again since you arrived. And I see how you look at him when you think no one is watching. Life is too short and too hard to let happiness slip away because of propriety. But what if I am wrong? What if he does not feel the same way?" Helen laughed, a weak but genuine sound. "Child, I raised that boy. I know him better than anyone. He is besotted with you. He is just too honorable to say anything because he does not want to make you uncomfortable or abuse his position as your employer." She squeezed Grace's hand. "Someone is going to have to make the first move, and I do not think it will be him. He is stubborn that way." Grace did not know what to say to that, but Helen's words stayed with her, circling in her mind as she went about her work in the days that followed. February arrived with a false spring, warm days that melted the snow and brought green shoots pushing up through the earth. Helen continued to improve, growing stronger each day, and Grace felt the tension that had gripped the household begin to ease. One afternoon, Harlan asked Grace if she would like to ride out to see more of the ranch. Helen was napping, and the weather was fine, and Grace found herself agreeing before she had fully thought it through. Harlan saddled 2 horses, a bay gelding for himself and a gentle mare for Grace. She had not ridden in years, but the skill came back to her as she settled into the saddle. They rode out across the valley, following the creek up into the hills. The air was sweet with the scent of new grass and wildflowers beginning to bloom. Birds sang in the oak trees, and the sky was a blue so deep it hurt to look at. Grace felt her spirits lift, the constant worry of the past months falling away as they rode. Harlan led her to a high point overlooking the valley, and they dismounted to let the horses graze. From here, Grace could see the ranch spread out below, the buildings like toys in the distance, and beyond, the rolling hills stretching away toward the mountains. "It is beautiful," she breathed. "It is," Harlan agreed, but when Grace glanced at him, she found he was not looking at the view. He was looking at her. The air between them seemed to crackle with tension. Grace's mouth went dry and her heart hammered against her ribs. This was the moment. She could feel it. "Grace," Harlan said, his voice rough. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen before you say anything." She nodded, not trusting her voice. "When I hired you, I was just looking for someone to help with my mother. I never expected to find anything more. But from the first day, you have surprised me. Your kindness, your strength, your gentle way with Mother, the way you have brought life back into our home." He took a step closer. "Somewhere along the way, I started to care for you, more than care for you. I have fallen in love with you, Grace. I know I should not say it. I know it is not proper, given our arrangement, but I cannot keep pretending that what I feel is just gratitude or appreciation. It is more than that. It is everything." Grace felt tears well up in her eyes, but they were tears of joy. "Harlan," she whispered, "I love you too. I have for weeks now, but I was afraid to say anything, afraid you would think me forward or inappropriate." "Inappropriate," he repeated with a huff of laughter. "Grace, there is nothing inappropriate about two people caring for each other." He reached out and gently cupped her face in his hand, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped. "I want you to stay, not as a hired caregiver but as my wife, if you will have me." Grace's breath caught. "Harlan Zane, are you proposing to me on a hillside in the middle of nowhere?" "I suppose I am." He smiled, and it transformed his usually serious face. "I do not have a ring, I do not have fancy words, but I have a heart that is yours if you want it." "I want it," Grace said. And then she was in his arms and he was kissing her, and nothing in her life had ever felt more right. They rode back to the ranch hand in hand, stopping frequently to kiss and to marvel at this new thing between them. Grace felt like she was floating, her heart so full she thought it might burst. Helen took one look at their faces when they walked into the house and started to laugh. "Well, it is about time. I was starting to think I would have to lock you two in a room together." "Mother," Harlan said, but he was grinning. "Do not mother me, I have eyes. I see what is in front of me." Helen looked at Grace with satisfaction. "So when is the wedding?" Grace and Harlan exchanged glances. They had not discussed details, too caught up in the wonder of admitted love. "Soon," Harlan said. "If Grace agrees, I do not want to wait." "Neither do I," Grace said softly. They were married 6 weeks later in Grass Valley in the small church on Mill Street. It was a simple ceremony, with Helen in attendance along with a few neighbors and townsfolk who had come to know Grace during her supply trips. Grace wore a new dress of soft green wool, and Harlan wore his best suit, brushed clean and pressed. He looked devastatingly handsome, and when he took her hand and spoke his vows, Grace felt her heart might burst with happiness. The Reverend pronounced them man and wife, and Harlan kissed her softly, reverently, as if she were something precious and fragile. Grace kissed him back, tasting salt from her own tears, feeling the solid strength of him against her, and knowing she had found her home at last. They returned to the ranch as husband and wife, and Helen insisted on giving them privacy by remaining in town for a few days with a friend. The house felt different, intimate, as Grace and Harlan explored this new dimension of their relationship. Harlan was a gentle lover, patient and attentive, concerned always with Grace's comfort and pleasure. She had been nervous, having no experience, but he made it easy, made it beautiful. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the bed that had been his and was now theirs, and Grace traced the lines of his face with her fingers. "I never thought I would have this," she confessed. "After my father died, I thought I would spend my life alone, moving from one position to another, always on the outside looking in at other people's happiness." Harlan caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "You will never be alone again. I promise you that." "What did I do to deserve you?" she whispered. "You cared for the people I love without even trying to win my heart, but you won it anyway every day in 1,000 small kindnesses." He pulled her closer. "You are stuck with me now, Grace Zane." Grace smiled at the sound of her new name. "I can think of worse fates." When Helen returned to the ranch, she was delighted to find the newlyweds glowing with happiness. Life settled into a new rhythm, with Grace now mistress of the house as well as Helen's caregiver. The two women grew even closer, and Helen often said that she had gained not just a daughter-in-law but a true daughter. Spring advanced into summer, and the ranch prospered under Harlan's careful management. Grace proved to be an asset in more than just household matters. She had a head for figures and helped Harlan with the account books, spotting inefficiencies and suggesting improvements. Together, they made plans for the future, talking late into the night about expanding the herd, improving the grazing land, perhaps even buying the adjoining property if it ever came up for sale. In early July, Grace realized she had missed her monthly courses. At first, she dismissed it as stress or a change in routine, but when the nausea started and her breasts grew tender, she could no longer deny the truth. She was carrying Harlan's child. She told him on a warm evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the hills. He had been talking about the price of cattle, and she interrupted him mid-sentence. "Harlan, I am pregnant." He froze, his words trailing off. Then he turned to look at her, his eyes wide with wonder. "Pregnant, you are sure?" "As sure as I can be without a doctor's confirmation." "But yes, I am certain." A slow smile spread across his face, and then he was laughing, picking her up and spinning her around despite her protests. "We are going to have a baby. Grace, we are going to be parents." "Put me down, you madman," she said, but she was laughing too. When he set her down, he kissed her with such tenderness that fresh tears sprang to her eyes. "I love you," he said against her lips. "I love you so much. I love you too." They told Helen that evening, and the older woman wept with joy. "A grandchild," she said, pressing her hand to her heart. "I never thought I would live to see this day." "Do not talk like that," Grace chided gently. "You will be here to see your grandchild grow up. You are not going anywhere." "I will certainly try my best," Helen said with a watery smile. The pregnancy progressed without complications, and Grace bloomed under Harlan's doting attention. He fussed over her constantly, much to her amusement, trying to prevent her from doing any heavy work and worrying whenever she showed the slightest sign of fatigue. "I am pregnant, not dying," she told him repeatedly. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I will be fine." But she loved his attention nonetheless, loved the way he would rest his hand on her growing belly and marvel at the life they had created together. Helen's health continued to improve throughout the summer and fall. The stroke had left permanent weakness on her right side, but she learned to compensate, and with Grace's patient help, she regained much of her independence. She could walk short distances with a cane, could feed herself, could even help with light household tasks. Grace knew that some of the improvement was due to Helen's determination to be well enough to help with the coming baby. Winter arrived again, and with it, the first serious snowfall. Grace was now heavy with child, her belly round and prominent, the baby moving constantly within her. The doctor in Grass Valley, consulted on one of their rare trips to town, had pronounced her healthy and estimated the baby would come in late February. On a cold night in the middle of February, Grace woke to a cramping pain in her lower back. She lay still for a moment, breathing through it, then felt a gush of warm liquid and knew her time had come. "Harlan," she said, shaking his shoulder. "Wake up. The baby is coming." He jerked awake instantly, momentarily disoriented. "What now? But it is too early. Only by a week or two. Babies come when they are ready." Grace tried to keep her voice calm despite the flutter of nervousness in her chest. "You need to ride to town and fetch the doctor." "I am not leaving you," he said stubbornly. "Harlan, I need the doctor, and your mother is here. I will not be alone." Another pain gripped her, stronger this time, and she gasped. That galvanized him into action. He dressed quickly, kissed her hard on the mouth, and was gone, his boots pounding down the hallway. Grace heard him explaining the situation to Helen, then the sound of the front door slamming and hoofbeats fading into the distance. Helen appeared in the doorway, leaning on her cane, her face determined. "Come on, then. Let us get you ready. I have delivered a calf or two in my time. I imagine a baby cannot be that different." Despite her pain, Grace had to laugh. The labor was long and difficult. The pains came closer and closer together, each one stealing Grace's breath and making her cry out. Helen stayed by her side, offering water and cool cloths and words of encouragement. But as the hours wore on and there was no sign of the baby, Grace began to fear something was wrong. Dawn was breaking when Harlan finally returned with the doctor, a grizzled man named Patterson who had seen just about everything in his 40 years of practice. He examined Grace quickly, his face giving nothing away. "The baby is turned wrong," he said finally, "but I think we can fix it. Mrs. Zane, this is going to hurt, but I need you to be brave." Grace gritted her teeth and nodded. What followed was a blur of pain and pressure, Helen holding one hand and Harlan the other, the doctor working with quick, sure movements. Grace screamed, beyond caring about dignity or propriety, focused only on the overwhelming need to push to get this baby out to end the agony. And then, suddenly, relief. The sound of a baby's cry, thin and reedy but strong. The doctor's voice saying, "It is a boy. You have a son." Grace collapsed back against the pillows, exhausted beyond measure as the doctor placed the baby on her chest. She looked down at the tiny, red-faced creature, his eyes screwed shut, his fists waving in indignation, and felt her heart expand with a love so fierce it was almost painful. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "We have been waiting for you." Harlan was crying, tears streaming down his face as he looked at his wife and son. "He is perfect, Grace, he is absolutely perfect." "What will you name him?" Helen asked, leaning over to peer at her grandson with wonder. Grace and Harlan looked at each other. They had discussed names, but somehow none of them felt right in this moment. Then Grace remembered the man who had built this ranch, who had brought Helen west and given her a life here, the man whose absence still echoed in the house. "Daniel," she said. "For your father, Daniel Harlan Zane." Harlan's eyes filled with fresh tears and he kissed her forehead. "Daniel, it is perfect." The days that followed were a haze of exhaustion and wonder as Grace recovered from the birth and learned to care for her son. Daniel was a hungry baby, nursing frequently and keeping her up at all hours. But Grace did not mind. She would sit in the rocking chair by the window, nursing him in the quiet darkness before dawn, and feel a contentment she had never known. Harlan was a devoted father, taking over as many household tasks as he could to allow Grace to rest. He would walk the floor with Daniel when the baby fussed, singing old cowboy songs in his rough voice, and somehow the baby would always settle, soothed by the sound of his father's heartbeat. Helen was equally besotted with her grandson. The baby gave her new purpose, new energy, and she insisted on helping with his care despite her limitations. She would hold him for hours, rocking him and telling him stories, and Grace would often find them both asleep, the old woman and the infant, peaceful in each other's company. As spring returned to the valley, Grace felt herself healing, gaining strength. By the time the wildflowers bloomed, she was back to her full duties, though now with the added joy and challenge of caring for a baby. One afternoon in late April, she stood on the porch watching Harlan work with the horses in the corral. Daniel was asleep in a basket at her feet and Helen sat beside her in a chair, enjoying the warm sunshine. "Are you happy?" Helen asked suddenly. Grace looked at her in surprise. "Of course I am. Why would you ask?" "Because I want to hear you say it. I want to know that this is the life you want, not something you settled for because you had no other options." Grace thought about the question seriously. A year ago, she had been alone in Carson City, scraping by on her meager savings and wondering what would become of her. She had answered an advertisement out of desperation, expecting nothing more than a roof over her head and modest wages. Instead, she had found love. She had found family. She had found a home and a purpose and a future full of promise. "I am happy," she said firmly. "Happier than I ever thought possible. This is not what I expected when I came here, but it is everything I needed." Helen smiled and reached over to squeeze her hand. "Good. That is what I wanted to hear." That evening, after supper had been cleared away and Daniel put down for the night, Grace and Harlan walked out to watch the sunset. It had become their habit, this quiet time together at the end of the day, a chance to reconnect and share the events of their separate labors. Harlan put his arm around her waist, pulling her close. "Did I tell you today that I love you?" "Only 3 times," Grace said with a smile. "You are slipping. Cannot have that." He turned her to face him, his hands on her shoulders. "I love you, Grace Zane. More than yesterday, less than tomorrow." She reached up to touch his face, marveling at how familiar it had become, every line and angle dear to her. "I love you too, more than I have words to express." He kissed her then, slow and deep, and Grace felt the familiar warmth kindle in her belly. It had been weeks since they had been intimate, the demands of new parenthood leaving them both too exhausted for anything beyond stolen kisses. But now, with Daniel sleeping soundly and Helen settled for the night, Grace felt desire stir. Harlan felt it too. She could see it in the darkening of his eyes, the way his breathing quickened. "Should we?" he murmured against her lips. "We should," she agreed. They went to their room and closed the door, and for a little while there was nothing in the world but each other, the sweet rediscovery of bodies and pleasure, the affirmation of the bond between them. Afterward, Grace lay in Harlan's arms, her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I never thought my life would turn out like this," she said softly. "When I came here, I was just trying to survive. I never imagined I would find love." "Neither did I," Harlan admitted. "I was so focused on taking care of Mother and keeping the ranch going, I had forgotten what it was like to want something for myself. Then you walked into my life and changed everything. Your mother was right, you know. She said I cared for your heart without even trying." Harlan chuckled. "She always was a romantic, even if she hid it under that stern exterior. But she was right. You did care for my heart. You healed it without me even realizing it was broken." Grace propped herself up on one elbow to look at him. "I was broken too. I just did not know how much until I started to heal. You did that for me, Harlan. You and your mother, you gave me a place to belong." He pulled her down for another kiss, tender and full of promise. "You will always belong here. This is your home. We are your family." "I know," she whispered. "I know." The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and growth. Daniel thrived, growing from a colicky infant into a robust toddler with his father's dark hair and his mother's gray eyes. He was curious and adventurous, always underfoot, always into something, keeping Grace busy from dawn to dusk. When Daniel was 2, Grace became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, her body knowing what to expect. She gave birth to a daughter in the spring of 1887, a tiny thing with wisps of blonde hair and lungs that could wake the dead. They named her Margaret, after Grace's mother. Helen doted on both grandchildren, and they revitalized her in ways Grace had never expected. The older woman who had been so frail when Grace first arrived was now active and engaged, though still limited by the effects of her stroke. She taught Daniel his letters and numbers, told him stories of the old days, and sang Margaret to sleep with lullabies from her own childhood. The ranch continued to prosper under Harlan's management, aided by Grace's business acumen. They expanded their holdings, buying the neighboring property when it came up for sale, and hired 2 hands to help with the increased workload. The ranch house was enlarged, with new rooms added to accommodate the growing family. Life was not without its challenges. There were harsh winters and dry summers, sick cattle and broken equipment, the constant financial pressures of running a ranch. But Harlan and Grace faced these challenges together, supporting each other through the difficult times and celebrating the victories. In 1889, Helen suffered another stroke, this one more severe than the first. For a terrifying week, she hovered between life and death while Grace nursed her with desperate determination. But Helen rallied, though this time the recovery was not as complete. She was confined to a wheelchair, her speech slurred, but her mind remained sharp. "I am not ready to go yet," she told Grace one day, gripping her hand with surprising strength. "I want to see these children grow up a little more." "Then you will," Grace said firmly. "You are the most stubborn woman I know. If you are not ready, death will just have to wait." Helen lived 3 more years, long enough to see Daniel start school in Grass Valley and Margaret learn to walk and talk. Long enough to hold Grace and Harlan's 3rd child, another boy they named Peter, born in the summer of 1891. She died peacefully in her sleep on a cool October morning in 1892. And when Grace went to wake her, she knew immediately that Helen was gone. The older woman's face was peaceful, unlined, as if death had taken years away instead of adding them. Grace sat beside the bed and wept, mourning not just the loss of her mother-in-law but of a true friend, a mentor, a second mother. Harlan found her there and held her while she cried, his own tears falling into her hair. "She loved you," he said. "She told me once that you were the best thing that ever happened to this family, that you saved us both." "She saved me too," Grace whispered. "She gave me a chance when I had nothing. She welcomed me into your family and made me belong." They buried Helen on a hill overlooking the valley, next to Daniel Sr., where she could watch over the ranch she had loved. The whole town turned out for the funeral, testament to the respect Helen had earned in her long life. In the days and weeks that followed, Grace threw herself into caring for her family, keeping busy to stave off the grief. But at night, lying in Harlan's arms, she would cry for the woman who had become such an important part of her life. "It is all right to grieve," Harlan told her. "She would want you to mourn her, but she would also want you to keep living, to find joy again." Grace knew he was right. And slowly, as the seasons turned and life continued its inexorable march forward, the sharp edges of grief softened into a gentler sadness, then into memory tinged with love and gratitude. Life on the ranch continued. Daniel grew into a serious, responsible boy, already showing signs of his father's dedication and work ethic. Margaret was her opposite, wild and free-spirited, always climbing trees and catching frogs and coming home covered in dirt. Peter was still too young to show much personality, but he was a happy, placid baby who rarely fussed. In 1894, Grace became pregnant for the 4th and final time. She was 35 now, and the pregnancy was harder than the previous ones. She was tired constantly, her back ached, and she could not seem to get comfortable no matter what she did. "This is the last one," she told Harlan firmly. "I love our children, but I am getting too old for this." He kissed her swollen belly. "Whatever you say. Though I have to admit, you are beautiful when you are pregnant." "Liar," she said, but she smiled. This time she gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl, in the spring of 1895. The birth was difficult, and for a while the doctor was worried, but Grace was strong and determined. She brought both babies into the world, exhausted but triumphant. They named the twins Samuel and Sarah, and with their arrival, the Zane family was complete. 5 children, all healthy and thriving, filled the ranch house with noise and chaos and immeasurable joy. The years that followed were busy ones. Between managing the ranch, raising 5 children, and maintaining the household, Grace and Harlan had little time for themselves. But they carved out moments where they could: morning coffee before the children woke, evening walks after they had been put to bed, rare trips into town alone. Their love deepened with time, seasoned by shared trials and triumphs, by the daily work of building a life together. They learned each other's rhythms, anticipating needs before they were spoken, communicating with glances and touches as much as words. On their 10th wedding anniversary in 1896, Harlan surprised Grace with a trip to San Francisco. They left the children in the care of the ranch hands and a hired woman from town, and took the train west to the city. Grace had never seen anything like San Francisco. The tall buildings, the crowded streets, the bustle and noise and energy of the place overwhelmed and exhilarated her. Harlan took her to fine restaurants, to the theater, to shops where she could buy dresses and hats and other luxuries rarely seen in Grass Valley. But the best part was simply being alone with him, rediscovering each other away from the demands of children and ranch. They made love in their hotel room with an abandon they had not experienced in years, reconnecting on a level that went beyond the physical. "I love you," Harlan said as they lay tangled together, the sounds of the city filtering through the window. "I know I say it all the time, but I want you to really hear it. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Grace. Every day with you is a gift." Grace felt tears prick her eyes. "I love you too, more than I can express. You gave me a home, a family, a purpose. You gave me everything I never knew I needed." "We gave it to each other," he corrected. "That is what marriage is it not? Two people building something together, something bigger than themselves." "When did you become such a philosopher?" she teased. "I have always been deep," he said with mock seriousness. "You just never noticed because you were too busy wrangling children and running the ranch." She laughed and kissed him, and for a little while longer they forgot about everything except each other. They returned to Grass Valley refreshed and reconnected, ready to dive back into the wonderful chaos of their life. The children had missed them but had managed just fine, and Grace realized with a mixture of pride and melancholy that they were growing up, becoming more independent. Daniel was 12 now, already helping significantly with the ranch work. Margaret was 10, still wild but showing signs of the strong woman she would become. Peter was 7, quiet and bookish, more interested in reading than ranching. And the twins, Samuel and Sarah, were 4, inseparable and utterly adorable. As Grace stood on the porch one evening watching her children play in the yard, Harlan came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "How lucky I am," she said simply. "When I answered your advertisement 14 years ago, I was just looking for a job. I never imagined I would find all this." She gestured at the scene before them, the children laughing, the ranch spread out in the evening light, the life they had built together. "I was the lucky one," Harlan said. "You came into my life when I needed you most, and you cared for my heart without even trying. You just were yourself, and that was enough." Grace turned in his arms to face him. "We were both lucky. We found each other when we needed it, and we built something beautiful together." "We did," he agreed, and kissed her as the sun set behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The years continued to pass, marked by the milestones of their children's lives. Daniel grew into a fine young man, taking on more and more responsibility for the ranch. At 18, he was already as capable as his father, and Harlan spoke with pride of the day when he would hand over the reins completely. Margaret, at 16, remained as spirited as ever, but had also developed into a skilled horsewoman and a talented artist. Her sketches of ranch life and the surrounding landscape covered the walls of the house, and Grace treasured each one. Peter, at 13, had discovered a love of learning that set him apart from his siblings. He talked of becoming a teacher or perhaps even going to university, ideas that seemed impossible and wonderful all at once. Harlan and Grace encouraged his dreams, setting aside money for his education. The twins, Samuel and Sarah, were 10 now, still close but developing their own distinct personalities. Samuel was adventurous and outgoing, while Sarah was thoughtful and kind, always the first to help when someone was in need. In 1901, Grace turned 42, and Harlan threw her a surprise party, inviting neighbors and friends from town. As Grace looked around at all the people gathered to celebrate her, at her husband and children and the life they had built, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. Later, after the guests had gone home and the children were in bed, she and Harlan sat on the porch in comfortable silence, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. "You ever think about how different things might have been?" Grace asked. "If I had not answered your advertisement, if you had hired someone else, all the time," Harlan admitted. "And I thank God every day that things worked out the way they did. I cannot imagine my life without you, Grace. You are woven into every part of who I am." "And you into me," she said softly. "We have built something good here, have we not?" "The best," he agreed. "A family, a home, a legacy for our children. What more could we ask for?" Grace thought about Helen, the woman who had brought them together, who had seen the potential for love between them before either of them had recognized it themselves. "I wish your mother could see this. See how the children have grown, how the ranch has prospered." "I think she can," Harlan said, gazing up at the stars. "I like to believe she is watching over us, pleased with what we have made of our lives." "I think so too," Grace agreed, and sent up a silent thank you to the woman who had welcomed her with such grace, who had given her a chance to become part of this family. The new century brought changes to Grass Valley and to the ranch. The mining industry that had built the town was beginning to decline, and many families moved away seeking opportunities elsewhere. But the Zane Ranch continued to thrive, diversifying their operations and adapting to changing markets. In 1903, Daniel married a local girl named Emma, and they moved into a house Harlan had built for them on the far side of the ranch property. Grace gained a daughter-in-law and, a year later, her first grandchild, a boy named Thomas. Holding her grandson for the first time, Grace felt the circle of life complete itself in a beautiful way. Margaret announced her engagement in 1905 to a young man from Sacramento who had come to work at one of the mines. Harlan was skeptical at first, protective of his daughter, but the young man proved himself sincere and hardworking, and eventually won Harlan's approval. Peter left for university in 1907, the first person in the family to pursue higher education. Grace cried when they put him on the train, proud and sad in equal measure. But Peter wrote faithfully, sharing his experiences and his studies, and came home every summer to help on the ranch. Samuel and Sarah remained at home, helping with the daily operations of the ranch and showing no inclination to leave. Grace was grateful for their presence, even as she encouraged them to pursue their own dreams if they wished. As Grace approached her 50th birthday in 1909, she found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this place. From a lonely, uncertain young woman answering an advertisement in a newspaper, to a wife, mother, grandmother, and pillar of her community. It had been a remarkable transformation, made possible by love and determination and the willingness to take a chance on an uncertain future. Harlan, now 54, had aged well, his hair silver at the temples, his face lined but still handsome. He moved a bit slower than he once had, and sometimes his joints ached on cold mornings, but he was still strong and capable, still the man Grace had fallen in love with all those years ago. They celebrated Grace's birthday quietly, just the family, with a cake Margaret had made and presents from the children. As Grace blew out the candles, she made a wish not for herself, but for all of them, that they would continue to be blessed with health and happiness and each other. That night, lying in bed beside Harlan, Grace felt a profound sense of peace. Her life had not been perfect. There had been sorrows and struggles along the way, but it had been good. Better than good. It had been everything she had never dared to dream of. "What are you thinking about?" Harlan asked, sensing her wakefulness in the darkness. "Just how grateful I am," Grace said, "for all of this, for you." He pulled her closer and she nestled against him, her head on his chest, the steady beat of his heart a comforting rhythm beneath her ear. "I am the grateful one," he murmured. "You cared for my mother when she needed it most. But more than that, you cared for my heart without even trying. You just loved me, loved us, and that changed everything." Grace smiled in the darkness. "Your mother said that once, do you remember? She said I cared for your heart without even trying." "She was a wise woman," Harlan said. "She saw what was happening between us before we did." "She did," Grace agreed. "She brought us together in a way. Without her, I never would have come here." "Then I owe her everything," Harlan said simply. They lay in comfortable silence for a while, and Grace felt herself drifting toward sleep. Just before she slipped under, she murmured, "I love you, Harlan Zane, with all my heart." "I love you too, Grace Zane," he whispered back, "always and forever." The years that followed were gentler ones. As Harlan and Grace aged, they gradually stepped back from the day-to-day running of the ranch, passing more responsibility to Daniel and the younger children. It was bittersweet, letting go of work that had defined them for so long, but also freeing. They had time now for the things they had always put off. Harlan built Grace a garden, and she spent happy hours tending flowers and vegetables. Grace taught herself to paint, producing lovely watercolors of the ranch and the surrounding hills. They took long walks together, revisiting favorite spots and reminiscing about the past. More grandchildren arrived, filling the ranch with the sound of young voices once again. Grace delighted in them, less burdened by responsibility now and able to simply enjoy their company. She told them stories of the old days, of how she had come to marry their grandfather, of their great-grandmother Helen, who had been such an important part of the family. In 1915, Margaret and her husband moved back to the ranch with their 3 children, taking over a section of land and building their own house. Having her daughter close again brought Grace immense joy. Peter returned from university with a teaching position in Sacramento, but visited frequently, bringing his wife and eventually his children to spend summers on the ranch. Watching her scholarly son with his own family, Grace felt a fierce pride in the man he had become. Samuel and Sarah both married and remained on the ranch, their families expanding the Zane holdings even further. The little ranch that Harlan's father had started so many years ago had grown into a substantial operation, supporting multiple families and providing a good living for all. On a warm summer evening in 1920, Grace and Harlan sat on the porch watching the sun set, as they had done thousands of times before. Grace was 61 now, Harlan 65. Their hair was white, their hands gnarled with age and hard work, but they still held hands like young lovers. "Do you have any regrets?" Harlan asked suddenly. Grace considered the question seriously. "None," she said finally. "I wish I could have known my parents longer. I wish your mother could have lived to see all her great-grandchildren, but regrets? No." Everything I have experienced, good and bad, has led me here to this moment with you. I would not change any of it." Harlan squeezed her hand. "Neither would I. You have given me the best life I could have imagined, better than I deserved." "Nonsense," Grace said firmly. "You deserve every happiness. You are a good man, Harlan Zane, the best man I have ever known." "Because I had a good woman by my side," he countered. "You made me better, Grace. You and my mother, you shaped me into the person I became." They sat in comfortable silence as the light faded and stars began to emerge. In the distance, they could hear the sounds of their grandchildren playing, supervised by their parents. The ranch was alive with family, with the legacy they had built together. "I hope we have many more years together," Grace said softly. "But if we do not, I want you to know that I have been happy, truly, deeply happy. You gave me that gift." "And you gave it to me," Harlan said. "We gave it to each other." As darkness fell, and the first cool breeze of evening stirred the air, they rose and went inside together, hand in hand, partners in everything as they had been for more than 30 years. Their story was not one of grand adventure or dramatic passion, but rather of quiet love, daily devotion, and the building of something lasting. It was the story of a woman who came looking for work and found a home, of a man burdened by duty who found joy, of two hearts that healed each other without even trying. And it was a story that would continue, passed down through generations of Zanes, a testament to the power of love, family, and the courage to take a chance on an uncertain future. Grace and Harlan lived many more years, surrounded by children and grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren, their love story becoming the foundation upon which all the generations that followed were built. In the end, when Grace finally passed peacefully in her sleep at the age of 78, surrounded by family in the house she had made a home, Harlan held her hand and whispered his love one final time. He followed her 2 years later, and they were buried side by side on the hill overlooking the valley, next to Helen and Daniel Sr., the family reunited at last. But their legacy lived on in the faces of their descendants, in the ranch that still bore their name, in the love story that became family legend. A story that began with a simple advertisement in a newspaper and a desperate young woman who answered it, not knowing she would find everything her heart had ever longed for. A story of how Grace Zimmerman came to care for an elderly woman, and without even trying, cared for a cowboy's heart as well, healing it and claiming it for her own. And in doing so, found her own heart healed and claimed in return, two souls binding together to create something beautiful and lasting that would echo through time. The ranch still stands in Grass Valley, California, passed down through generations of Zanes. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sun sets over the hills painting the sky in gold and crimson, those who live there swear they can feel the presence of Grace and Harlan, still watching over the land and family they loved so much. Their story never truly ending but continuing in the lives of all those who came after them.